Good day, and welcome back to our study of the book of Romans, lesson 10. Today this is on the third chapter, verses 3 to 8. Now, in order to keep this in context, it's important to remember the time when this was written and the beliefs of the people at the time this was written, because the Jewish nation had believed their covenant with God through Abraham made them a special people, made them a people that would be blameless before God, irregardless of what they did, irregardless of how they acted, irregardless of what events they partook in. Therefore, they felt very special, they felt very honored and very privileged, and really did not obviously need to maintain a relationship with God that God had requested. So when Paul gave this admonition to the Jewish people in chapter 2, in which he said that those people who were circumcised, the Jewish people, who did not keep the law, would themselves be judged by the uncircumcised people, the Gentiles, who may have kept the law, and that therefore they were both on the same plane. This would have shaken the Jewish nation considerably in those days and caused considerable anger against Paul. So this was the statement that he made, that there was no one special. God had no priorities. God did not play favorites. The Jewish people were no different than the Gentile people before God's and before God's judgment and wrath. So then he came up with these questions. Now, whether people actually asked him these questions or whether he, through the Holy Spirit, developed answers to questions which maybe the general population were proposing, we don't know. But anyway, there were these questions. And in verses 1 and 2 of this, we had one question: if the Jewish people and the Gentiles were on the same level before God, and all had to face his wrath and his judgment, then what advantage had the Jew? What is the profit of being circumcised as God had directed? And Paul answered this by saying that God had given the Jewish people the privilege of having his oracles, his commandments, his laws, his instructions for them, and that they were the keepers of these oracles. They were the keepers of God's commandments. And that was the main provision that they had. The main advantage that they had is that God had given them his divine directions and his divine instructions, more so than any other people. So this was one advantage that the Jewish nation had. But there was this covenant that they believed they had, which made them impervious to God's wrath and judgment. So then the next question in verse 3 says, "For what if some did not believe?" What if some were not faithful to this covenant? What if some did not have the faith that they were meant to have? Will their unbelief make the faithfulness of God without effect? In other words, will their unfaithfulness mean that God is also unfaithful in his part of the covenant? Now, it's known that God understands our thoughts. It says in Psalm 94:11, "The Lord knows the thoughts of man, that they are futile." It also says in 2 Timothy 2:13, "If we are faithless, he remains faithful. He cannot deny himself." So it says that God would remain faithful even though we are unfaithful. And if the Jewish people look back in their own history, they would have realized that this was the case, because all through the book of Judges, we see how the nation of Israel became unfaithful over and over again to God. And yet when they prayed to him and asked for his help, he came back and rescued them and brought them back into some kind of control and some kind of prosperity, some kind of a relationship with himself, only to have the same cycle repeated over and over again. So when they were unfaithful, God remained faithful. So this really answered their question. Will their unbelief, their unfaithfulness, make the faithfulness of God without effect? Certainly not. Indeed, let God be true, but let every man be a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and may overcome when you are judged. Now this phrase, this last two lines, really refers back to 2 Samuel chapter 12, where Nathan was confronting David after his triast with Bathsheba and what he had done to Bathsheba and to her husband, the Hittite. And God was bringing his condemnation upon David through the prophet Nathan. And David understood that he was the one who was guilty. And God was just in condemning himself for this. And it says in Psalm 54, verse 4, against you, you only have I sinned. David is saying this to God. Against you only have I sinned, and done this evil in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak, and blameless when you judge. So what he's saying, his actions, his unfaithfulness, was all of his own doing, not God. And God was just when he was causing David, or coming against David for his actions. So it says, indeed, let God be true. And this has to be one of the hallmarks of faith, is that God must be considered to be true, regardless of what mankind thinks or says or develops or implies, that God himself must be considered basically true. Let God be true, and let every man who speaks against God's truthfulness, every man be considered false or a liar. And this is what David said. This is what David came through when he was confronted by Nathan the prophet on God's behalf. Against you and you only have I sinned. See, the reason for this was the fact that the Jewish people had in their idea, in their philosophy, that they were so special that no matter what they did, they could not be held blameless. They could not be held to account because they were automatically going to heaven. And this whole idea of Paul had shattered that belief. But sometimes people only read part of the Bible. And this is when the people would say that through Abraham, all the world would be blessed. And Abraham had a covenant with God. But they don't sometimes read the whole story. So there is a thing, it says in Genesis 18:19, for I have known him, which means Abraham, in order that he may command his children and his household after him. So God knew Abraham. God and Abraham had this covenant so that Abraham could command his children after him that they keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. The idea of this covenant was if the nation of Israel kept their promises to God. And they did not do this, and God knew they would not do this. In Deuteronomy, it says, in chapter 31, this is when Moses and Joshua were coming to the promised land. It says, and the Lord said to Moses, behold, you will rest with your fathers, and this people will rise and play the harlot with the gods of the foreigners of the land where they go to be among them, and they will forsake me and break my covenant which I have made with them. Then my anger shall be aroused against them in that day, and I will forsake them, and I will hide my face from them, and they shall be devoured, and many evils and troubles shall befall them. So that they will say in that day, have not these evils come upon us, because our God is not among us? And I will surely hide my face in that day, because of all the evil which they have done, and that they have turned to other gods. The Jewish people had this in their history, and they knew that the covenant was dependent upon their relationship being maintained with God. And yet they still expected God to do everything for them only. So when God seemed to turn against them, or when Paul made this promise that they would be judged the same as everyone else, they really should not be surprised. And this is what it says: let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words, so that God would be justified in what he says, and that you, God, would be overcome, would be come out on top, would be the one correct when you are judging, really what it should mean, when you are doing the judging. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts a wrath? I speak as a man, certainly not. For then how will God judge the world? For if the truth of God has increased through my lie to his glory, why am I also still judged as a sinner? In other words, if God's evidence of God's glory is increased by the sin that man does, and the greater the sin, theoretically the greater the glory of God in his mercy, then why are people who do evil judged as doing wrong? If a person who does evil is actually glorifying God through illustrating how God's glory overcomes evil, why then is he judged? And that's really what the Jewish people are saying. We have no faith, and we're doing evil, but God's glory is increased, so why are we judged as being evil for that? If our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, why is God, what shall we do? Why is God unjust? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? Okay? So if God's wrath is inflicted against people who do evil, even though that evil tends to illustrate and magnify the goodness of God, why are people judged? And Paul says, speaking as a man, this is his question as a man. But if God allows evil to go unpunished, how can he judge the world? And it says he's going to judge the world. And he knows this. It says in Genesis 18:25, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? He will be the judge of the earth. And the Jewish people knew this, because that implies that they would be judged at the time. In Ecclesiastes 12:14 it says, for God will bring every work into judgment. So, through their own scriptures, they knew that they also, being part of the earth, and being part of the works of the earth, that they would be judged. So, why would God not be unjust, inflicting wrath to people who, through their evil, bring out this righteousness of God? And Paul himself answers the question, that certainly not. He's not going to be considered unjust, or how else would he judge the world? If the whole world is to be judged, what else would you judge the world on except the works of man and how they depart from the will of God? And then it goes on to say, for if the truth of God has increased through my lie to his glory, why am I also still judged as a sinner? If I sin or do evil, and God's truth is increased as a result of my doing evil, or am I committing sin? Then why am I judged as a sinner? So the idea is, when people do evil, when people do things, when people commit a crime, when people commit some kind of injustice of any type, they don't do it with the intent of bringing God's goodness to bear. They don't do it with the intent of magnifying God's goodness and God's grace. They do it out of their own natural instincts and their own basic lusts and desires. It's not done to glorify God, even though the glorification of God may in some cases come through because of it. But that's not the intent when it's being done. It's being done for one's own selfish interests and activities. So therefore it's not done for the purpose of bringing out the righteousness of God or bringing out the truth of God. It's done for our own base desires, and therefore, even though it may cause God's goodness and truth to be magnified, it is basically done evil. It is basically wrong. It is against God's direction, and therefore needs punishment. We often talk sometimes about Judas, who betrayed Christ, and says that Judas has gone to hell, or will be in hell because of this. So if this was the means by which Christ's crucifixion came about, and that was God's plan, why is Judas in hell? Well, because the Bible indicates that Judas, being a person with free will, could have judged that himself and denied doing what he had to do, or prevented in doing what he had to do. But he did it for the base purpose of 30 pieces of silver and his own greed. Therefore he's guilty, even though it comes out as magnifying God's direction and God's basic purpose. And this is what it says here. If our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? Certainly not. For then if you don't do this, how is God going to judge the world in the end? If the truth of God is increased through my lie, why should I be a sinner? Because I'm still lying. Because it's still something against God's direction. And why not say, let us do evil that good may come? And some people at that time were saying this was the whole idea of Paul's and Christ's idea of being saved by grace and not by works. They were saying this in a slanderous way. Why not just do evil? So that God's grace can come, so that God's grace can be magnified, so that God's grace can be greater. Let's do evil. And let's just rely on God's grace. But that's not the purpose. The purpose of this is to show that God's grace can be magnified, but it's still evil to do something which is wrong and against God's will. If we are slanderously reported, if the people who were Christians at the time were reported to be in a slanderous way, to be apparently suggesting that you can do evil and just rely on God's grace, if that's what it was, if some affirms that we say that, then their condemnation, God's condemnation of them, of the people who imply this type of thing, this type of activity, their condemnation is just. It is just that they be condemned for that type of statement. So this whole part is answering the questions: if there's people are unfaithful, is God unfaithful? No. God is true. People themselves, ourselves, are not. We are the liars. We are the ones that are doing the falsehoods. And this is illustrated by David's response to Nathan in Psalm 51, verse 4. He said, the blame is all his, and against you have I sinned. So if God is faithful, even if we are not, but if we can accentuate and illustrate His goodness and His grace and His truth by our sin and our evil doing, why are we judged? That's what Paul is asking here. And we're judged because we do it, not as a means and a purpose to illustrate His goodness and His truth, but we do it for our base purpose, even though it may, in the long run, help accentuate His truth and His righteousness. We do it for a different reason. We do it, and if we are accused, if people say that we do that we are actually saying this, that we can do anything, that we can do anything we want, and that God's grace will overcome it. If that's the impression that people have gotten, and that's what people are saying, that we are saying, then that's wrong. And the people who say that deserve the condemnation. It says that their condemnation is just. This seems rather complicated, but it really isn't when you think about it carefully. It's just saying that God is faithful even when we're not, and that our actions are our own actions. If they impart a greater sensitivity to God's truth and His righteousness, that's okay, but it doesn't excuse our actions. Our actions, if they're evil, if they're self-centered, if they're self-indulgent, they're still not in accordance with God's work. And therefore, even if God is brought out because of it, the base intention is our own, and we are still to be condemned and judged for it. There's nothing in the Bible which says that you can do evil just for the sake of bringing out God's goodness. So, this is really the story of these 3 verses. We are told to stand firm in God's direction and in God's commands, not to do evil, to bring out God's apparent goodness and His truth. And if people say that against us, we are to stand firm against that. It says in Isaiah that no weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue which rises against you in judgment you shall condemn through the heritage of the servant of the Lord, and their righteousness is from me, saith the Lord. When people are reviled and people are condemned or judged because we stand up for God's truth, it says in Matthew 5:11-12, Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So, stand fast. Don't be taken in by the false accusations of people. Don't say that people can do evil just to bring out the goodness and the grace of God. Don't be afraid of the fact of God's faithfulness. He is always faithful, even though we are rarely so. That's the lesson of Romans chapter 3, verses 3-8. I hope it made some sense to you. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me next week as we continue on in the study of Romans and in chapter 3. Bye for now.